So people generally have a lot of questions about life, and they really want to understand the meaning of their life and where they're going and those kind of things. But the one thing that we really have to understand is the principle behind humanity and the universe, and that's really the key. And a good analogy of that would be like the White brothers who first flew in North Carolina. Before they could do it, a lot of people had attempted to fly, but they were all missing one point, and that was understanding the principle behind flight, the principle of aerodynamics. Once they understood that and applied it properly, only then could they actually achieve flight. And there's a very deep lesson there. Likewise, when we search for the meaning in our lives and how we can relate to all things, we have to understand the principles behind the universe and behind the creation of humanity, which inevitably leads us to the causal reality in the universe. And we refer to that causal reality as God. And, there's a lot of surveys and questionnaires that go out for just, general people to ask them, do you believe in God? And more often than not, it's answered affirmatively. But we're not really just talking about the belief that there could be a God, because that's really the easy aspect of it. But more important, and somehow perhaps the more challenging part of that, is what is your relationship with God? Or what is the nature of relationship between human beings and God? If we find that God is just a force field or just an energy source, then that will pretty much determine the relationship that we will have. Whereas if we discover some sort of emotional content and some kind of consciousness or heart, likewise, that's going to really determine greatly the nature of our relationship with God. It would look more towards a intimate relationship. And these are some of the things that we want to explore in the principle of creation. We're going to start by trying to understand the dual characteristics of God, the nature of God. That's going to be kind of our focus. So if we start by understanding how God is, or what God is, and how that dictates our relationship with God, what is it that we can actually say about God? One of the things that we can say definitively is that God is invisible, is that there is some sort of invisible nature of God. So with that primary characteristic out of the way, how then can we come to know the nature of God if he is invisible? Now, if you can see the screen and see that beautiful picture there, that's Catherine's Gorge in the Northern Territory. I remember going in there when I was really, really young. If you haven't been there, go there, because as you can see, it is sublime, sublimely beautiful. And this kind of relates to something that St. Paul said in Romans 1:20. He said that since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. And what Paul is talking about here, he is essentially saying that yes, God is invisible, but because he is invisible, people often say that as an excuse, that means he's irrelevant. And, I'm not going to bother to believe or try and understand God because of that invisible nature. But Paul is saying that's not an excuse, because though he is invisible, he manifests himself in a very visible form. And so God's nature is made manifest in the things that he has created. And that would be much like an artist revealing themselves in an artwork. So this brother here is Albert Namatjira. And, of course, he passed away in the 50s, and I never met Albert Namatjira. I doubt anyone here has. But he left behind a lot of his artwork. So kind of in this sense, the artwork is the visible manifestation of Albert Namatjira. It's the expression of the artist. The artist, in a sense, is invisible in that we may never have met the artist. but we can understand about his struggles and his despairs, his hopes and his dreams through those visible manifestations. And that's kind of the foundation to understand what Paul is saying about God. God is invisible, yet though he has invisible nature, he is visibly manifested in creation. And that's really what Romans chapter 1, verse 20 is talking about. So for our purpose today, we're going to examine those elements in creation and assess the common components of creation. And we understand the core common elements of all things in the entire universe. We can understand that as the nature of God. The nature of God is expressed commonly as a common center and is manifested in all things. So if we can extrapolate that common characteristic as we examine the wide spectrum of existence, we can understand that that must be the visible manifestation of God. In fact, people in the scientific field they're beginning to understand this, or not just understand it. They've understood it for a while, but they're beginning to find it in a very substantial way. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, who's a theoretical physicist. He was instrumental in developing string theory. And he talks about this, that there are designed rules underlying the creation of the universe. That is the fingerprint of God. And we can see the fingerprint of God on the universe. And that's what we want to have a look at. If we were to really simplify this, which is what we're going to do, because, we don't have a whole lot of time, but, simplicity and complexity, they somehow work together. We can be infinitely complex with things, but we can also be very simple and reach the profound. So we're going to be simple. And we're going to look at the simple common elements in the universe. And what we see, first of all, is a pair system. All of creation exists in pairs. It's reflected in the very, basic structure of all the building blocks of matter, plus and minus. There's day and night, in and out, up and down. And if we sample some of the smaller things of creation, we would see it. And if we refer back to the image of God, male and female, man and woman, we see that pair system. This is rendered in Genesis 1:27. That a man and a woman are described as the image of God. So that pair system, is something that indeed reflects the very existence of God himself, not just from a logical basis, but from a biblical one too. So when God imparts himself upon creation, whether it be in an atom, with the electrons spinning around the center, or with the plant, with the stamen and pistil interacting for the existence and multiplication of plants, or the male and female structure of animals, or then, getting back to the man and the woman, the human level. From the most basic building block of matter to the most complex, we see a fundamental common element in the creation, that everything is existing in a pair system. And the Bible tells us that that is the very image of God. So this reality, this gives us a window of understanding more about the nature of God. And we're going to go there. We're going to open up that window and have delve a little deeply into that pair system. And basically what we are seeing is that any entity that exists is going to manifest in these dual characteristics. So that's dual pair mode. And we're going to borrow a little bit from the Eastern philosophy here and talk about yang and yin, a positive and a negative. Many times I try and think of what is a good example to kind of explain this in a practical term. And so I go to sports and I think of something like basketball, for example. What would be an example of yin basketball and yang basketball? Well, you have offense and defense, offense and defense. It's a positive and a negative. They're two different sides and they are in play at the same time. Either you're playing on the offense if you've got the ball, or the defense if the enemy has the ball, the opposition have the ball. The game is bearing these two components. But we also see another deeper type of dual characteristic in all things, and that's the dual characteristic of out of form and inequality, or internal nature and external form. And that is a much more fundamental dual characteristic. In terms of a person, you would think, well, okay, they've got a body and a personality. The personality or the mind, this is the invisible nature, the internal nature, and their external form that exists in a tangible way. And those two relate together as one. We can kind of separate them categorically, but you don't so much separate when you meet someone, their mind and body, and deal with them differently, unless perhaps you're a surgeon or something. You are, when you deal with a person, you deal with both of those. They are united. So we go back to our basketball analogy, and what's an example of internal nature and external form for basketball? Well, internal nature would be the game plan. If you're a coach running a basketball team, you got to have a game plan. And the external nature would be the execution of that game plan, the game play. That's an example of the internal nature and external form of a basketball game. So this kind of structure and functioning is the foundation of everything in creation. And then we can extrapolate that back to the first cause, to the very existence of God. And we can conclude that system must come from God. As we already saw in Genesis, chapter 1, verse 27, that male and female are the image of God. And we can say that positive and negative, or original yang and original yin, originate in God and God's dual characteristics of yang and yin, positive and negative, of male and female, really serve as the archetype and the standard for all positive and negative relationships in creation. Also related then to God, this second type of dual characteristic, the internal nature and external form, that's something that originates in God. So what would be the kind of original form of God? I mean, as we know, God does not have a physical body. The Bible points out that God in John 4, chapter 4, verse 24, as being a spirit, that God is spirit. So the term, in these terms, the kind of spirit is the container or his form. We would say that God is a spiritual being. There are many types of spiritual beings. There's angels, there's people who have passed on into the spiritual world, many types of spiritual beings. But when we talk about God's essential nature, we've got to transcend that external form and go deeper and really touch the essence of God. And we then enter into God's internal nature. And that's where biblically we go to 1 John chapter 4, verse 16. God is love. So God is spirit. That would be his container, the vehicle, the mode of God's expression and activity. And God is love is more a manifestation of God's inner nature and consciousness. So ultimately, when Jesus referred to God as Father, that's a heartistic, loving identification, which stands as the essence of God's internal nature in his dual characteristics of nature and form. Well, we've got a whole mess of dual characteristics. How do they work together? One thing we know, in Mark 12:29, is that God is one. God is not divided. He is not separate within himself. but he is one, he is harmonized. And so when we look at God's dual characteristics, for example, his original internal nature and original external form, we would say that is the most essential manifestation of God. And then out of that, out of his original nature, his internal nature, comes the dual characteristics of yang and yin, male and female. So we can see that masculine and feminine nature originates in God, and masculine and feminine form originates in God. The essence of the dual characteristics of internal nature and external form, out of that comes the dual characteristics of yang and yin. But they're all harmonized within God. God is one. Not a separate, many separate entities, but it is one being harmonized. So God's dual characteristics aren't separate. They are harmonized, forming the one existence that we know as God. And here's our biblical reference. God is spirit, John 4:24, and God is love, 1 John 4:16. So we can see that we're moving towards now the idea that the nature of our relationship with God is going to be one of intimacy. It's going to be one of tenderness, of very personal relationship with God, because God's original internal nature within that is beating the heart of a loving parent. God is one. 12:29. So as a God of ones, who has created via the same principle of his own existence, then we could say that everything in creation, all dual characteristics by which everything is created, is ultimately seeking to come back into relationship with God, to come into a state of being that reflects the archetype. So God is the template of what all pairs should do and how all pairs should function. And as a result of that, we see that between God and creation, there is a reflection, which again touches on what Paul was saying in Romans 1:20. Why does the creation reflect God? Why is there a resonance between God and the creation? Well, it's because the creation is existing via the same principle by which God himself exists. God is very efficient, very intelligent. When he created, he didn't have to think up a new principle by which to create. Basically, he resourced himself. He examined himself and said, hey, I exist pretty good. What are the principles by which I exist? Well, there's this pair system, there's plus and minus, there's male and female, and subject and object, harmonized in oneness. And I think that works, So rather than thinking up some new principle by which God would create, he simply, I say simply, but he applied his own life existence principles to the creation. So the principle of creation is the principle by which God exists. And that's why God and creation reflect one another, because they are operating and existing and thriving and multiplying and developing via the same principle. And this is what it means in the first chapter of John, when it talks about, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the universe was made through the Word, and that Word became flesh. That's what that's talking about. God isn't using a separate word or principle, but he's using his very own life word. And that's why Jesus later said, man does not live on bread alone, but by every word. That word has life because that word is the template by which God himself is existing. That's why Romans 1:20 works, because we see the visible image of God in the things he has created. And most essentially, we see that image in the relationship between man and woman. That's why God created Adam and Eve. We see that Jesus really nails it here in Matthew 19, verse 4 to 6. He says, "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife." And here's the important point, "and the two will become one flesh, so that they are not two, but one." Two will become one. You got to stop being two and become one. There's a transformation there. And this is really touching on that kind of magic that happens between the harmonization of two becoming one. As a matter of fact, when you look throughout the Bible, whenever it talks about being one, it automatically implies the relationship between the harmonization of two becoming one. For example, Jesus said that believers are to be one as God and Christ are one. So two become one. It's the idea, the idea of one doesn't mean single, but suggesting two positions attracting, interacting, harmonizing, and ascending to a position where they're in a state of unity and oneness. Like a husband and a wife are the classic example of this. They don't kind of mold into one body, but they unite and they harmonize. They become one. You ever met it? There's a couple of couples that I know that are very much one. I know that if I tell them, yeah, there we go. The Derbyshire couple, for example, what a beautiful couple. If you say something to Jacinta, you can better believe maybe Ian will hear, and vice versa, perhaps. They become one, they unify, they harmonize. And that's very much the purpose of the relationship of man and woman in marriage. That's the plan of God. So let's go a little deeper in this, and let's talk about this four-position foundation, this process of harmonization, which we're going to call give and take action. And we want to understand, what is that process by which two become one? Not only is this relevant for husbands and wives, but it's really relevant for anything that we do, because every activity in life, it will involve an interaction of two. A subject and object relationship, no matter what we're doing, whether it's my mind and body, or whether it's me and my work, or me and my car, there is an interaction, a give and take, and harmony is attempted to be achieved there. And when it does, when you do achieve harmony, then it becomes something very special. So let's take a look at that, the idea of give and take action. We know that God is the creator, and that God created via the word. And by that we mean, God is the template of all existence, because God is the template, then when God creates, he manifests his plus and minus, his dual characteristics. They are manifested when he creates. So we could call subject and object this kind of manifestation of his plus and minus, whether it's positive and negative, or day and night, or in this case, red and blue. Red and blue are quite interesting colors and very helpfully illustrate the point I'm trying to make, because when you put red and blue together, they create a third color. They create purple. And, that's one of kind of the, mysteries perhaps, that, why do plus and minus attract? They merge and become one. There's a kind of a force of attraction there. There's some kind of basis that allows or pushes those plus and minus particles to come together. whether there's, there needs to be some kind of common base for that to occur, whether it's between molecules or a common base needed for a certain amount of electrons to spin around a nucleus, and attracting molecules to join and become one. And it's what it is really that within the subject and object is something in common. And having something in common is what causes them to attract and gives them the foundation to be able to engage one another. Have you ever had a conversation with someone you don't know? My screen went black, is that? Oh, I'm back. Can you all hear me? Give me a wave if you can hear me. Adieu. Okay, I'm not sure what happened there.
What's happened?
My screen went black. Did nothing happen for you guys?
No.
It's just me, was it?
Yeah, no, it's all going good, mate.
It's all going good?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, good.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, is there?
All right. Phew. We will continue then. Sorry, my screen just went black and I freaked out. So, subject and object. There's something in common. There's something in common that brings you together. Like the example being when you meet someone that you don't know, the first thing you do is, if you want to get to know them, is you try and find a common base. You find a common point of interest, whether it's somebody you know, or that maybe you barrack for the same footy team, or you have the same interests somewhere. And when you hit, when you score a point there and you find something that you both have in common, then the give and take starts. The energy builds up and you form, the relationship begins to take form. And it's kind of, forces really take over it like that in that situation. So this is how give and take action happens, is that the subject and object, they have something in common. And, what is it that they have? All subject and objects have in common? Well, it's the template from which they were formed. And where is that template? That template is God, the archetype. Again, remembering that God is one. God is the origin, not just of all things, but he's also the origin of the principle by which things are existing and acting and functioning and developing. So plus and minus attracting one another, because they both come from the original template, who is the harmonizing center, is the archetype of what all harmonized characteristics should be. God is harmonized, so therefore plus and minus in the creation will likewise form a union that reflects the original template. When plus and minus become one, that union is formed. And as Jesus said, they're no longer one, no longer two, but they become one. They form a union. And, if it's a union of plus and minus, or the union of red and blue, or between man and woman, that's something very special, kind of magical even. Because what happens when that union appears is that there is a transformation of sorts. 1 plus 1 becomes 3. Red and blue merge and you get magenta. 1 plus 1 becomes 3. The elements of the natural world, like sodium and chloride, they come together and they form salt. Salt is unique to both sodium and chloride. When you look at yourself in the mirror, you look a little bit like your father, a little bit like your mother, but you also look a little bit like yourself. There's mom and dad and yourself. That's 3. We are all kind of a 3 in 1. So the union which is formed, somehow it achieves a status of being a value greater than the sum of its two parts. And that's really the magic of the process of harmony. Or if we go back to my analogy of the sports team, if a sports team that's got a good offense and a good defense, and it's got a good game plan and it executes that game plan, if a team has that, then they have what's called chemistry or momentum, and they can beat another team that has superior athletes by having greater team cohesiveness and chemistry. And that's kind of magical force of chemistry is that's achieved by union, by harmony, by uniting. So this status of being united is very desirable, and we want to get there. And it's also really understood very well in the sporting community, might not be the right word. In sports, they understand if our team is united, we can defeat another team. And so it's really sought after, and really athletes that play in team sports are really trained. Again, if they play an individual sport, they're really trained to have unity with their own mind and body. It's applicable to all situations to achieve that very desirable state of unity, of harmony. So, even within sports, God will bless the union with a greater power and with a greater spirit and with greater tendency to bring about their hopes and dreams. That's what happens in this kind of four-position foundation. So also in that four-position foundation, God can have a give and take with the object in the union, and with the subject and object, and we call that the triple objective purpose. So this diagram is kind of a flat representation, so it's not 100% accurate, not really a correct rendering of what it looks like, because we're talking about a spherical motion, each position having an interaction with each other position. They're all engaged with God in that give and take relationship. And when horizontally and vertically that action is taking place, we see a spherical motion. And that's kind of the fundamental manifestation of the archetype of God, the template. Spherical motion then really stands as kind of that, the image manifestation of God. As a result, all things in creation, reflect this type of spherical structure. And whether it's the basic unit of matter, like an atom, or if we go out a bit further into the solar system, I always notice that the solar system looks a bit like an atom, right? It's got the same structure, the same principle, same forms. We can go out even a bit further and we have a look at, we find spiral galaxies where there's a center established and a turning motion around that point. It's a fundamental movement that is manifested in God's life principle. You look at a hurricane as well, a high pressure and a low pressure, they meet, there's a turning motion, and the eye of the hurricane appears. The center disappears, suggesting vertical motion. The same thing when you see water go down the sink, there's that circular motion and the center appears. And at that center of movement, that's the fundamental structure of the four-position foundation, and God is the center of the four-position foundation, the ultimate center, the causal being of the universe. So yes, God is invisible, but I think he's becoming much more visible. Everywhere we turn, we see the fingerprint of God, and the more we examine that fingerprint, we'll discover that his deepest expression is the manifestation. Is manifested in the simple words that I love you. For God is love. And so it's within God's image that this feeling, this ideal of love was to be magnified and substantiated. Adam and Eve were to be the recipients of God's love and were to embody it in a loving relationship between husband and wife and expand that to the family, the society, and the world. We see this reflected in Scripture when we look at Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33. Paul says, let each man of you love his wife as his very own self, and let each wife sees that she respects and reverences her husband. So this is talking about give and take action. And husbands, you've got to give first. It's not a take and then give. And it's not a you give and then I'll take. It's a I give first. And when we can give first and initiate that giving, then we initiate the response. And that's really like the starter motor to that give and take action. So we have to initiate love for there to be any give and take action. And man and woman naturally seem to be attracted to one another. And of course, we understand now that the common base between a man and woman is the existence of God, that God is the template, that God is the one and creating, who was creating man and woman in his image. God is divided, is one. So the archetype or template of marriage is something that's implicit within God. That's why marriage isn't a human invention, but it's something that is fundamentally a part of God as the Word. And when we say the Word, the ideal of marriage is an integral part of that Word that was with God and that is God. And so this is why we see that God has instructed that man and woman interact and become one. And what is the virtue to bring those two into one? What is that virtue? Well, they have to turn that wheel. We've got to turn the wheel of relationship for that vertical alignment to appear. We've got to turn that wheel. And we see that in 1 John 4:16. It says that God is love, and he who lives in love then lives in God and God in him. So we see when we live in love, when we spin that wheel, that's when God lives in us and we in God, when we live in love, the horizontal and that vertical. So he who lives in love, they're turning that wheel, and when the wheel turns, that vertical line appears. It's much like a gyroscope, which is why I have this lovely picture here. And this gyroscope is really not balanced at all. And if you were trying to balance this unbalanced gyroscope by picking it up from the top and attempting to put it and balance it on its tip like the other one without spinning it, it'd be pretty impossible. And you would say to yourself, gee, these gyroscopes are tough and they're impossible to balance and they can't be done. But it's just like a marriage. In order to get it to stand up, you got to turn that wheel. You got to have some give and take. It's exercising that virtue, the virtue of living for the sake of others. Like Paul said in Ephesians 5, husbands, make the decision to love your wife. And that's really, a key point to it. Paul says that all grace will abound to those who decide in their heart. And that's the thing, love starts with a decision. So in our modern secular world, we really operate under the delusion that love starts as an emotion or a feeling. But in truth, love starts with a decision to act, a decision to subscribe to a certain virtue, which Christ talks about many times. He was articulating it when he said that, give up your life and you will gain your life. It's a decision. He was talking about it when he said, first, think of the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness, and then all things will abound to you. If you notice something about that, he's always asking, you first, you decide to give, and then the universe will respond. So husbands, love your wife, and she'll respond. Think first of the kingdom, and all things will be added onto you. Give up your life, and you will gain your life. That's the virtue that brings two into one. And the challenge about that virtue is that first you got to turn the wheel. First you got to, before the love and the feeling, I'm talking about the real love, the love that lasts forever and continues on forever. Before that love, you have to turn the wheel. You've got to make that decision, and then love will be brought to bring love and life into you. And without God, this doesn't happen, because, the type of love I'm talking about, the eternal love, that comes from God. When we make the decision to live in love, we live in God, God lives in us, and that's the key to everlasting life, everlasting love, and everlasting relationship. So let's touch on an important point here related to Adam and Eve. God told Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, he gave them 3 blessings. He said to them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and have dominion over it. So there's a certain priority here with Adam and Eve. He didn't say multiply and then be fruitful whenever you can. He starts out very clearly and he says, be fruitful, then multiply, and then dominion will be established. So what's he talking about? We're talking about the 3 blessings that God has given Adam and Eve, and we want to describe these clearly because they're really the model for a true and perfect human society that God was imparting upon his sons and daughters, which unfortunately, as we can obviously see, they did not heed. What does it mean to be fruitful? Well, this is talking about first our spirit and body relationship. Remember, we got to get back to the dual characteristics principle. So we are created as man and woman, a manifestation of dual characteristics, but individually is where we see the most essential dual characteristics of spirit and body, or mind and body, our personal, internal and external characteristics. That's why it's one reason perhaps why it's more fundamental. So before man and woman become one, they must first be fruitful. And you know what that is? That's like the marriage of your mind and body. There has to be an internal marriage before the external marriage between man and woman can take place. So the first blessing means individual perfection, the unity of spirit and body. And then on that established integrity, the unity of perfect man and woman. So the unity of perfected man and woman means that Adam and Eve could stand as true parents. And true parents means that when Adam and Eve come together as husband and wife, they would give birth to children that are God's direct descendants. God's direct descendants. And that would be the foundation for sovereignty, for dominion. And that would expand through their lineage. God would exercise an external sovereignty upon the earth and in spirit. So to be fruitful, Adam and Eve would have to go through what we call a growing period. Just like what we see in the natural world, an apple tree has to go through 3 stages of growth: formation stage, a growth stage, and a completion stage. And when it arrives at perfection, that's when it bears fruit, which bears the seed for the next generation. Likewise, in a similar way, we think in terms of the first blessing. That's when Adam and Eve had to achieve as a prerequisite to be able to multiply, to be able to stand as husband and wife, to be able to enter into the relationship of husband and wife, they would have to be fruitful. Now, there's a number of ways to understand what that means. And I like what Jesus said in Matthew 5, verse 48, that we must be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. And, if we go to the New Testament Greek telos, which would mean perfect or mature, complete. So Adam and Eve in the first blessing have to become mature and complete. And what does that mean essentially? Well, in 1 John chapter 4, verse 12, it says, if we love one another, God dwelleth in us. And this is the key. And his love is perfected in us. God has placed the capacity to love as God loves. That's why Jesus implores us not only to receive this love, but to return that love back to God and to love God with our whole heart. And what kind of love is God worthy of? Well, he's worthy of perfected love. That's our job. That's the job of Adam and Eve, is before they join together as husband and wife, that they perfect this capacity of love, which God has given them. And how would he accomplish that? That's a very fundamental way. God put the fruit in front of them, and he introduced to them a very amazing word. The word was no, don't eat. So what's going on here? Like in our presentation of the fall of man, we're going to go very much in depth as to what God, what God wants Adam and Eve to achieve, and what the meaning of this fruit really is. But for the purpose of our presentation today, we're just going to say that it's a carnal desire, something that the flesh wants. Now, God is introducing the word no to Adam and Eve. You have to say no to your body. That's a very deep principle. What is it God wants Adam and Eve to achieve? He wants them to achieve and inherit his capacity of love. And as we saw in 1 John 4:12, that God has placed his love within us, and we are supposed to perfect that love. So how do we do that? What's the process? Well, think about everything in creation. Everything in creation is controlled by natural law. But we know that God, in essence, is not natural law. He is love. So Adam and Eve had to transcend the realm of natural law and in order to enter the realm of love, a love relationship with God. How do you transcend the realm of natural law? Well, there's only one way. You have to say no to your body. The body represents the entire natural world. And so they do so, as they do so, they enter the realm of love. That's why any civilization that introduces the principle of premarital abstinence, requiring men and women to say no to their carnal desire, it is also a civilization where love in marriage would emerge. So there's a relationship between the idea of premarital abstinence and the love commitment in marriage, a very direct relationship. So God wants them to transcend the natural law, and he gives them the authority to do that because, if you think, your body's very adamant, very determined. It's not going to listen to just no, unless you are authorized by God with that power. God gives them the commandment and then really ignites their capacity to have faith. So by giving them that capacity, this is like pushing the baby bird out of the nest in order to, that's what instigates it to fly. There's the, where the baby bird really wants to put into use its innate capacity to fly. That's exactly what God's doing with Adam and Eve. They have the innate capacity to have faith, and God ignites it by placing them in a position where they have to say no to their body, and not having the natural strength or authority to do that. They have to be awakened in this capacity of faith in God's word and then exercise their newfound strength. After all, the power of faith, the size of a mustard seed can move a mountain. And so by exercising this faith, they then enter into a life of self-discipline, self-government, self-control. Paul tells us that when we control our bodies, avoid sexual immorality, that is the pathway to sanctification, which means God dwells in us on the foundation of how we exercise this discipline over ourselves. Control our bodies. That's the key to preparation for premarital abstinence. It is the key that's to be able to enter into a marriage with the full power of love and the full readiness to make a full commitment to my spouse. This is what God is setting up in the Garden of Eden. This is what the process is. So this period to exercise responsibility, we can call that the kind of indirect dominion or the conditional period of the relationship with God, meaning that Adam and Eve have to keep their faith. They have to produce that condition of faith in order to maintain a relationship with God. And if they are successful in fulfilling that responsibility, they will then later, in perfection, enter the direct dominion of God, where their relationship with God will be impervious to any kind of interruption. It will be eternal and absolute. This is the perfection realm. And this is where their marriage was to begin. In this indirect dominion, the possibility exists that they might separate from God. How? If they break faith with the word of God and do not fulfill their responsibility. So when we study the fall of man later, we're really going to examine closely how well they did in the fulfillment of their responsibility. But you see, another very important thing to understand is that when God gave them this role, he was sharing his own role as a creator with them. In other words, the role of self-government. God is not a totalitarian God. He's actually extending to Adam and Eve a portion of responsibility. And we can say figuratively 5%. And, what is that? It is to exercise control over oneself. God has given us that unique responsibility. And by exercising that responsibility, we say that God's will is 100% fulfilled. We play a role. God is not a do-it-all for you God. We have to play, and Adam and Eve had to play a real substantial role. And what is that role? That is the role of co-creator. So in that respect, God creates mind and body. Adam and Eve have to unite mind and body. God creates man and woman. Adam and Eve have to accomplish the relationship. So God creates the parts. That's his 95% responsibility. Our 5% is through faith and obedience to his word, exercise responsibility and dominion over our body. Disciplining ourselves, we establish a realm of freedom where our hearts can receive the capacity to love. We can give love, and most importantly, we can grow in love. And that's really the meaning of the first blessing, is to achieve the standard of a true person, which is to establish myself as a person of true love and integrity. During this time, we're to flee from sexual immorality, which remains as a standard throughout all time. In 1 Corinthians 2:16 and verse 18, Paul lays it down very clearly. He says, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. So truly, it's very important, purity before marriage, abstinence before marriage. That's not a recent conclusion, but that has been the standard from the beginning. And that brings us to the ultimate purpose of purity before marriage. It means that had Adam and Eve perfected their love, they would have entered into their horizontal relationship with the full power of love, which means they had the full power to become one as God and Christ are one, as God is one. We also see in Malachi 2:15 that God expresses his motivation in having Adam and Eve strive towards this ideal of being one. And what was that? Why should they become one? God says, because God wanted a godly seed. God wanted his own lineage. He wanted Adam and Eve not to be false parents with a false lineage, but to be true parents that produced a true lineage, God's direct descendants. So we could say that God opened up, the dust and rib factory for a one-time only event, closed it down, and henceforth his clear intention was that this lineage of his sons and daughters would be a co-creation between God and his partnership with man. And therein lies the original sacredness of marriage, that really we enter into a partnership with God to be husband and wife, to build a family, to make substantial all the loves of God. And most importantly, to make substantial his very own lineage. We partner with God in the birth, not just of our children, but in the birth of his children, his sons and daughters. Therein lies the original value of marriage. So on that foundation of the multiplication, we see the expansion of God's sovereignty through his lineage. That was the plan. That was, God's sovereignty would be expanding through his lineage from the first family, expanding to the tribe, the society, the nation, the world, forever and ever. His kingdom would be upon the earth. And not only would people be able to say that, as you see me, you see the Father, but they would be able to see, as you see my family, and, you will see God. As you see society, so you will see God. As you see the world, so you will see God. That was the purpose and the motivation and the plan for creation. And obviously this didn't happen. We see quite a different world. The world that really manifests, at least in human society, is very different to being able to see God. We see God in the natural world, for sure. We see God when, we sit in a canoe in Catherine's Gorge. But we don't see God as much in our human world. We see a lot of violence. We see suffering. We see hatred. We see hunger, inhumanity, war, bloodshed. Somehow we got separated as the perfect representation of God. And we want to find out, in fact, that God lost his lineage in the beginning. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 6, it said that God, the Lord, was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain and sorrow. He grieved because Adam and Eve fell away from him. Adam and Eve did not carry out his will, his plan, and instead their lineage, rather than being a lineage of life, rather than being the vehicle of God's sovereignty, became instead the vehicle of Satan's sovereignty. Jesus said, you are of your father, the devil. And we've seen that, in the death of one man, so we see the death of all. And this has been the historical legacy of sin and has been the tragedy that has taken place since the fall. So we're going to study that a little bit more in our presentation on the fall of man. So that will conclude my lecture for now. And I hope we can see you again next week as we continue on this story. Thank you.